I want to first of all thank ICT, the International Campaign for Tibet. They asked me to do some sort of book discussions here in Paris and also in Amsterdam and Den Haag. I mean, I was planning maybe in the eventual future to do something, but since my book is not published here, these are all copies from India. And at the moment, the European edition, we're having some legal problems between them and us. You know, like Penguin is very high-powered, but nonetheless, I'm really glad to be here and that ICT taking the trouble. Wangput Tlatong and Tsering Chudunla over there, and over here, of course, Drukthar has taken the initiative, and Namgyala, who told me he lived on the old caravan route to Tibet in Pedong, from Kalimpong, which is wonderful to know. Now, and I want to thank you all for coming. It's just a big fat book, so, when I came here like 20 years ago, or something like that, the US Tibet Society had invited me. That time I had a book which was much more successful. It was only 200 pages also, and the mandala of Sherlock Holmes. So I mean, we had a big hall, and everyone was oohing and ahhing because they could read it, But this requires sort of, special people to appreciate. So let me try to give you a little special talk. Like, as Namgyala pointed out, this is rather on the big side. And but I had wanted to write a big book for one reason, because the whole Tibetan war of resistance against communist China was a huge affair. Most people don't realize it. It carried on for decades, 5 decades. If you just count only the communist invasion, if you take the Gomindang, sort of activities in Tibet and earlier Manchu invasions, then you can go back another 30, 40 years. All these intrusions and incursions by the Chinese imperialist forces into Tibet were largely, nearly all, resisted by the Tibetans themselves. Sometimes they were not in the, kind of a position to do so, but they did. And that's why I thought, because it's interesting, and there are wonderful people who, were involved in these things. And I thought I had to write something. And over the years, I had written plays, I had written essays, and even a book on the subject, and done a lot of reports for the Tibetan government on issues relating to this. So I thought I knew the subject very well, and my challenge was essentially one of genre. Now, how do I get this out there? Now, I didn't want to write just history. Nobody's going to read it. Right? So, what do I do? So, I sought to create something to fire the imagination of a new generation of Tibetans. People who don't know about this, but who need the memory. Right? And we have to pass on the memory. And I thought that only a substantial and captivating sort of book could immerse young minds in the story of the Tibetan freedom struggle and hopefully make it a crucial part of their lives. Now, I can't claim that I've accomplished this. It's up for you to judge, and for posterity. Maybe when I get some big award, you never know. But until then, all I can say is that what I had set out to do, I managed to do it. It took me 15 years. And of course, if you look at the size of the book, I took inspiration from Tolstoy. Just for the size, okay? I can't claim anything more. But I didn't want to write a novel. I believed that the stories, that I'm trying to tell here, of the many Tibetans that I knew, had just encountered, and some I knew very well, officials, peasants, housewives, muleteers, lamas, merchants, tribal chieftains, spies, resistance fighters, heroes, were rich and compelling enough for my narrative purpose. I had known many of these people personally. I interviewed them extensively. And some of them you couldn't even call interviews. I knew these people like over a bar table. Many nights, just talking and just making secret notes and things. In some cases, I'd even published their works, like the biographies of these people, like Hamad Sering, who's the kind of the main operations chief of the Tibetan resistance, and then also Ratungawang, one of the main heroes. All these people, me and my colleagues, we published their biographies. So I was, okay, whatever the faults, I had a kind of, I thought I could do it, and I knew how to do it. And so when I started, I realized there was another problem. I had many limitations because I don't have much of an education. So I didn't know how to start the book, especially something like this. So I fell back on the most fundamental of literary techniques, the first-person narrative. Now that's easy. So, and I began the story with my own account of being born in Darjeeling on April 14, 1949, before the communists came, and my journey to Lhasa a few months later. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of my family life, which is fairly interesting. It covers a lot of ground, and you might find it interesting. So it's there, second and third chapter. Okay, and also I don't want to take up too much time. The problem really I had, I get carried away, and then my listeners also seem to show interest, and then I get deeper and deeper into telling you stories, and before you know it, in a few hours I've gone. So I'm not going to do that. So this is I'm not too sure if my father took this picture or not, the first one. But I think it was there were very few people who had color film in those days, Kodikram. Sarongs had some, my family had, and even I think His Holiness and all didn't. Heinrich Harrer talks about getting one color film from Lowell Thomas, and he was so pleased with it. So coming from India, we did have this, and I think this was our caravan outrider, a guy called, if I remember, Tudu Gemba. That was the family name for him. So now I'll go on to the next picture, which is definitely our little caravan to Lhasa. My mother's at the back by the horse, which she's wearing a white hat. In the front is my nanny. She's holding a mug of tea. Her name was Pemas Hong, and others are relatives of hers. The horse, with the saddle blanket, you see with the name LP. That's Hawang Paljo. That's my father's Hawang Penjo. That's his name, but we had anglicized it, coming from Darjeeling. He was called Larry also, so it's Larry Paljo in Darjeeling. So yeah, that was our caravan. This is somewhere after Gau, a point from Tomo when you get up to the heights of the plateau. Before that, you're down the valley in Yatun, So then the next one that's me. And my nanny and a horse in the back, and a little waterfall at the back. So it was an idyllic place. All travelers who, usually they take the same route to Lhasa, they talk about it. So I won't go into details here. And this is me in Lhasa, on the top of my mother's family, the Tethong, their house, and my dad looking very snappy with his shades and his ensign boots. Those boots there was a special Kalimpong boot maker. Now, I have to go into this book. There's an old Chinese gentleman. He made wonderful riding boots. And if you were anybody in Lhasa, you had to wear these black riding boots, under your chuba. That was the style in Lhasa. And there's Tsepura at the back. And this was in, I think, 1949, beginning of 50. But as idyllic as this looks, and it was. I'm told I attended even the Nobulinga Shoten, in 49, that's the Tibetan Opera Festival. And we Tibetans have very civilized kind of opera tradition. You allow little babies in, and even your little apso, you can take drinks and do what you want. And I'm told I attended that. So I don't know, but I still feel sort of very special for having done that. But that's when the flowers are most wonderful in Lhasa. And that, they even have a little flower show at the Nobulinka. All the best plants are brought out on the stage. And but dark clouds were hovering over the idyllic kind of, the far Tibetan sort of horizon. And news was coming of communist invasion. They had already, China was beginning, Red China was beginning to win the civil war in China. The Kuomintang were losing. And everyone was scared. People had never seen a communist before. That's the problem. Some imagined they had, fangs. Some said they even had big ears, and that they could use one as a blanket, and the other as a mattress. Stuff like that. Stuff that you read in Herodotus. People in certain periods believed these sort of things. But then there were also more terrifying stories. Because when we came into Lhasa, there was the great comet of 49. You could see it early in the morning. It was south of Lhasa itself, on the Miduzari Hills. So that was a bit disconcerting. And then when 1950 came, after 4950, I think it was July, August, there was the big earthquake, the really massive Assam Tibet earthquake. That was much bigger than what we had this year inside Tibet. Many villages disappeared entirely. Rivers changed their course. It was a huge thing. And then, of course, I started howling in the night. And my mother, they all took me out. We all went out on the street. They looked up in the sky, and there was red clouds all over. And you could hear detonations, like cannon fire, like about 14. My mother said she counted. And what I'm telling you, so much is also my mother's memory. 98%. And she had a wonderful 20/20 sort of memory. So she said there were 14 detonations. And then people began to talk. But what was this? This is what we Tibetans call a Hama. The war of the gods of Tibet. Like you have Ragnarok or Götterdämmerung, with the German kind of epic stories. And the Tibetan one, Hama, is the Tibetan gods are fighting Gyandre, the demons from China. So that's what Tibetan, it's not an insult or anything. And this is kind of the way we refer to these things at that time. The gods of Tibet. And then the problem was that after a while, everyone felt that the gods of Tibet had lost the great battle. And I won't go into details here about the other kind of ominous signs that came. If you don't even read this book, there's, Heinrich Harrer talks a lot about it. Many others do, So finally in October, I think September of 1949, 50, we left Tibet, went back to Darjeeling. And then the 18th Army, PLA, marched into the frontier town of Tachado, Tachendu, or these days it's called Kangding, much bigger now. It's the main frontier town between China and Tibet in the old days. And this is in December of 1949. Now I'll go through this a bit quickly, only concentrating on certain aspects of the invasion that I don't think anyone of you are aware of. But let's say, just to give you an idea first of what the traditional Tibetan army was. We saw earlier the PLA, and the Tibetan army was really quite very well turned out at the time. There was a lot of patronizing put down of the Tibetan work, especially in the leftist press all over, because there was a great victory of communism taking place in China, and newspapers and stuff, even in this country, like The Guardian and all, had writers that were largely not sympathetic to the Tibetan cause at all. Especially people like Graham Greene, and the great writer, and his brother Felix Greene was absolutely a Maoist. So I just want to show you that these were soldiers with proper uniforms, proper headgear, gear. The Tibetan national flag, you see there, it's not something that Tibetans invented in exile, as many of our detractors try to point out these days. And even with little drummer boys there, it's a colonial hangover, and with proper weapons. They were using the 303 rifle. And this is the Tatang Maga, the 9th Regiment. And the regimental commander is General Degese. He was the son of the kings of Dege, who had taken service with the Lhasa government, So they fought valiantly. And I won't go into his detail, but I just want to show you this because if you've ever seen the movie 7 Years in Tibet, and of course they're trying to, it's supposed to be Tibetan propaganda. But in the movie they show Tibetan soldiers practically dressed in rags. And some of them even shooting bows and arrows, if you remember. It's ridiculous, So, in some ways, I don't know why they did that. Maybe to demonstrate how peaceful the Tibetans were. But no, this is wrong. This was a proper army. And the attack took place, even in this is a place called Markham. It's way south on the Yangtze River, the upper Yangtze River. There are 3 points on the Yangtze, on the Drichu, where the main Chinese attack came. One, the central, what we call, it was a crossing point for ferries, Kamdo Truga. In the north, there was a place called Denkor. And the south, he was holding it in Markham. Now, in the central zone, and this is a photograph taken by the PLA kind of photographer, maybe about a week or two after they had crossed over and defeated the Tibet. There was a small Tibetan contingent there, 150 Tibetan regular army and about 80 militia, Kampa militia. They fought practically to the last man. There's an eyewitness, Robert Ford, who was our telegraph operator, and he said he's one of the people who had survived, was wounded on Kampa, told him. He said, in the end, we were just using knives. We had run out of bullets, and a lot of people were killed. Even Chinese sources that have been accessed now by other scholars, especially a good French scholar, has said that a lot of people died there. But then the main general who controlled this area, this guy called Kachung Dever, one of the top. That's a picture of him, and he's very young, so that's all I could get. And he held this. His first contingent got wiped out, but he managed to ambush the advancing Chinese army in a gorge. He inflicted a lot of damage on them, and he began to withdraw. That was the whole idea with the Tibetans, is don't fight it all out there, just withdraw till you get to a much better, because a lot of these areas are practically indefensible. So he managed to get away, but finally up on the plains of Kyoshung, very high plains, he had about 700 troops left, and they were wiped out in the night. And Robert Ford says when he went down to China later, when he was a prisoner, and he said he saw the bodies. He said, and by that time winter was coming. So it was very cold, it was frozen areas. He said all the bodies of the Tibetan soldiers were frozen in bizarre shapes on the ground. The Chinese, the PLA, had dug graves for their troops, but the Tibetans were out there. So this was a tremendous defense, I think. We were outnumbered, we were outgunned, nearly in all these areas, like 10 to 1, 20 to 1. But these people did their job. They stood there and they fought. And they got wiped out. Now, this next person you see underneath looking very dashing is one of Tibet's most famous generals at that time, Mujadebir. And he had earlier, the communists tried to cross over in Dangkor to capture Tibetan telegraph post there. And then he's got his troops, he fought against a whole Chinese battalion. And he wiped them out. A lot of them jumped into the river, died. Mao Zedong even sent a cable after that to the Chinese general. And there are copies of that cable. I managed to get a copy of it. He said, you've got to be very careful with these Tibetans. Don't think that you can just get away by attacking them like that. He said he knew the Tibetans from the days of the Long March. And he said in these wild areas, you have to be very careful. So we have Mao's sort of word on this, how the Tibetans were fighting. Now, the problem after this was when the Tibetans were retreating, one of course was wiped out, but others were successfully retreating. And at that time, the Governor General of Eastern Tibet, who ran the administration as well as the army, was a senior Tibetan aristocrat called Ngabe. Some of you may have heard the name. And he wanted to surrender. Now, we don't know, and there's no clear kind of documentation on this. But I talked to people, and even like reading through the lines in some of even Goldstein's history of this period, it seems somehow they had gotten to him. The people from communist agents had managed to get him. He wanted to surrender. And the Tibetan government said, no, you can't. You have to retreat, Chitenchis. Because if they all retreated successfully, the next river is the Mekong. No, next river is the Salween after this. There's the Yangtze, there's the Mekong in Chamdo, and then there's the Salween in a place called Hodzong, which is fairly close to Chamdo. And that river is really wild. The Chinese call that area Nujang, and a wild river. There's only one bridge. And there's a good fortress on the other side, so they could have held it. But then the problem was that this Governor General decided he wanted to surrender. And unfortunately, when some Chinese advance guards came, on the road of his retreat, only about 100 PLA were there. And he had nearly 2,000 troops. And he had other troops coming to join him, like Muja's troops, his Persian troops. He said, no, we got to surrender. He hadn't fired a single shot. And he surrendered. Now, people call him all sorts of names. But I think we have to investigate this because it's not a question of just treachery. I am absolutely certain that this whole, the question of, brainwashing, thought reform, which the communists practiced on even like their own people, even in the Yan'an Mountains, to control the way people thought, is not something out of a thriller like The Manchurian Candidate. No, there are psychologists and actually experts who have written books, and I've got sort of half a dozen of them, with me. So this is something we have to take seriously, and I feel he had been gotten into. So, unfortunately, when he surrendered, he forced Robert Ford, who was our telegraph operator, and there were other operators, but he was the kind of the teacher. He was a very young English personnel who had just, after the war, he didn't want to go back home. And in England, there was food shortages and rationing and everything. He said he wants to stay in India and then Tibet, where he actually said he had a good time. And when people told him, even the Governor General told him, I think it's time, you resigned. He said, no, he wants to stay because he had friends, young friends also out there. And he said, it wouldn't be really right to sort of desert the Tibetans at their hour of need. So he stayed. He served 5 years in prison. He went through the thought reform, brainwashing, had a very difficult time. He was accused of murdering a Tibetan Lama, giving him poison that the British imperialists had told him to do, but that's ridiculous. Finally, he was released. And I have to tell you this, I managed to contact him 2 years before he died in London here. And at that time, the head of the London Tibetan kind of Dalai Lama's representative was a guy called Drukthar. He managed to arrange this thing for me. And he wanted to talk about this. Of course, I couldn't do any in-depth review, but I could ask questions. And then I also sent him the few chapters I did on this whole episode. And he was very happy. And he said he really was encouraging me to come up with this. And he passed away. And here we have a picture of Norbu. And, you know, Norbu is better looking, but, you know, I think Heinrich Harrer published this, and he wanted to have a villainous kind of Norbu. So there you are, you know. Now, very quickly I want to say, yes, we were betrayed in some ways by Norbu. And if you get to that, get through this book, I think my argument is pretty convincing that somehow there was a whole lot of brainwashing involved in this. But what happened was, although Norbu surrendered with about 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers, the previous Governor General, Norbu had just come in about 5 or 6 months earlier. The previous Governor General, you know, whose term had expired, he was supposed to go back to Lhasa. That's the usual thing. But the Tibetan government said, you have to stay at this fortress called Lhodzong. And he had about 500 or 600 troops with him. And so he stayed. This is, I don't have, that's him in 1937, that's the one in 1959. You know, but what he did, he thought he'd first hold out of the fortress, but the problem was after Norbu surrendered most of the troops, there was no way he could hold on to it. So he started a withdrawal, and a very kind of, let's say, sober kind of withdrawal, very careful. He fought a number of, he managed to attack even Chinese kind of advanced troops and inflicted quite a lot of damage to them. And it's even in Chinese sources, they said it was quite hard for them to advance. So he, from Shamdo onwards, he just kept on, you know, and where there's those little star shapes, that's where actually there were a lot of fighting. Finally he took, and on the way he managed to collect troops that had run away, right? Who hadn't surrendered and who didn't know where to go, or companies, and he managed to collect them. And finally, like 150 miles east of Lhasa, he stopped and he set up on the Nyangchu River, I think, probably, I'm not too sure, he set up a defense position. And from Lhasa, they sent him more regiments. They told him, hold that place. So when the PLA came to that point, they couldn't cross the river. There was some little kind of conflict, skirmishes, but then PLA couldn't come anymore. They couldn't take the risk. And he held his line, you know, for how long? 1 year. And I think that's very impressive. Yes, in Paris, I quoted the Emperor Napoleon, and I do so here. Napoleon said that to conduct a fighting withdrawal is one of the hardest maneuvers in sort of military operations. Primarily because whenever you retreat, there's a loss of morale with your troops, you know. So it requires a good general to do that. And somehow this General Hellu managed to do it. He was a very brave man. Just quickly to finish off with him, and if you look at the picture down there, even after, you know, like he held the troops there for over a year, in 59, you remember the uprising that took place in Lhasa? He didn't have to do anything, but he joined the uprising. And he fought. His wife fought also. Both of them, they were noblemen, you know, aristocrats. From the roof of their house, they fired on the PLA. He was arrested, beaten, struggled, what have you, and put in prison for like 20 years. So this was a very heroic general that we had. Now, the thing is that him holding that defense line for 1 year gave us Tibetans an advantage. Chanyi said, you have to negotiate. We said no, because we had a defense. So the government of Tibet at that time, the Dalai Lama and the cabinet were in a place we call Tromo on the Sikkim-Tibet border, what the Chinese call Yatung. So there the Tibetans managed to send emissaries and appeal to the United Nations. So the Dalai Lama and the Kashak launched a series of desperate appeals to the United Nations, beginning with a formal plea for help on November 7th. They had made an earlier appeal to join, to be allowed membership in the United Nations, but that hadn't been replied to. 6 days later, the Tibetan Cabinet and National Assembly made another impassioned appeal, vowing to the Secretary General that Tibet will not go down without a fight. When El Salvador, finally, was a sponsor, requested that the invasion of Tibet by foreign forces be added to the General Assembly's agenda on November 24th, Britain's veto crushed this initiative. Britain vetoed it. And then the Indians very cravenly followed the Brits. Because Indians had other reasons. Because they wanted to create a kind of anti-colonial sort of, let's say, united front, and to lead it. So Britain had other reasons. We're not too sure, but I met Hugh Richardson a number of times when he lived. He had retired in Scotland, and I lived in Scotland for 2 years, and he was convinced that something terrible had. He was a gentleman, so he didn't say so exactly. But when the first United Nations rejection came, Richardson told the press, and he was a former diplomat. He said the Tibetans were sold down the river. Initially, I couldn't believe it, because down the river is a kind of term you use for slaves in the south when they're sold down in New Orleans from the north, But he used that term. And he said, came out clearly, he expanded on this in a number of statements. And for that reason, the British government denied him any honors. Hugh Richardson was, at that time in the world, he was the leading expert on Tibet, leading authority. And he had a distinguished, let's say, diplomatic career, but no, they didn't get anything. Just a little pension. And that pension, actually, he even used to send us donations in Dharamsala. He gave me a 200-pound donation to Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts when I was there. He came to India. If you asked him to write an article for whatever journal you were running, he would do it. So, and he's an old man. So that was the end of Tibet's kind of attempt to, get the United States on its side. United Nations on its side. It tried even later. I think about 10 days later, we told the United States, please issue our delegates visas. We are coming. At that time, the United Nations was holding its sessions in a place called Lake Placid. The building in New York hadn't been built yet. And so Tibetans said, we're going to come to Lake Placid, but no, and that was it. So why Britain did that? Britain was the only country that actually had diplomatic relationship with Tibet, that had signed treaties with us, that had enjoyed our hospitality in Tibet. That people had come to every damn party that we had, and Tibetans know how to party. They had enjoyed themselves. We had given them chikasore. They had a good time. If you read all those, all those English visitors to Tibet, you'll see how they had a good time. And this is how we will repeat. We will repeat. I won't go into details now, but I just want to carry on here. And so finally we had to, send a negotiation team down to Beijing. But, this is something that, I don't like to talk about. It just really annoys there. But Norbu, the minister, who had surrendered without firing a shot, now offered his services as chief negotiator. He was a prisoner at that time. The Tibetan government's acceptance of Norbu as negotiator would prove to be fatally misguided. When photographed in Chengdu, he's in Chengdu, he was on the way to Beijing with Deng Xiaoping en route to Beijing. If you see this photograph, Norbu has already transformed his appearance. His official robes are discarded. He's not wearing official robes anymore. He's even cut his hair. And you can't do that in Tibetan bureaucracy, officialdom. If you cut your hair, you are no longer an official. It's really important that you have that top knot. These days people might think it's silly, but that's how the Japanese, even samurai, it was important for them to have that hair. If you cut your hair, you're nothing. But then, these are visible signs of his shifting allegiance. Unknown to Lhasa, he had accepted a position as vice chairman of the Chamdo Liberation Committee. That was the committee to rule eastern Tibet that had already been conquered, by the PLA. The chairman was General Tangwan Sen. And this raised serious questions about his loyalties. Whether he had formally joined the Communist Party remains uncertain even now. He later joined openly, but he might have joined earlier. But his actions would soon reveal whose interests he truly served. And now, of course, then they had the negotiations in Beijing. On May 23rd, Beijing radio broadcast news of the completed agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet and the 17-point agreement, stunning the Tibetan government and the Dalai Lama. They heard it on the radio. They had actually sent radio set with the Tibetan negotiators, but that wasn't used. It only came out in Radio Beijing. And the Dalai Lama said, neither I nor my government were told that an agreement had been signed. It was a terrible shock when we came to hear of it and the terms. The negotiators had signed away Tibet's future without the knowledge or consent of those he claimed to represent. So, yeah. Now, we'll pause here. There are a lot of chapters on this also. It's rather thick, but let me just go to the next phase. After the initial Chinese invasion, Tibet experienced a deceptive period of calm. The Chinese occupation force displayed calculated restraint, distributing millions of Da Yuan silver coins to high lamas, officials, what have you, and even to school children who attended their schools in Lhasa. However, this superficial peace shattered in early 1956 when the nomadic tribes of Lithang in far eastern Tibet, led by European Sonam Wangel, launched a fierce uprising against the Chinese forces. Now, this is the monastery of Lithang in its latest incarnation, fairly recent. It was completely rebuilt a number of times, but it was bombed also. In 1956, it was bombed to rubble, and there was big fighting there with the European. And this was rebuilt in, I think, late 1990s and also 2000. And this is a picture by an American photographer. And you see, one of the reasons why the monastery was completely destroyed was also because when the Tibetans fought there and they were losing, they always sort of backed off into the monastery. Tibetan monastery is not only where they have libraries and prayers, I said, if you have a war, that's where you retreat to. It's built like a fortress. So there were, I think, at least 10,000 Tibetan troops inside here fighting from the Lithang area. There were about 20,000 Chinese, but then they had bombers, they brought in artillery. It was a huge war. And the reason also why this just broke out in 56 was, a lot of communist policies were not implemented immediately in the same way throughout China and Tibet. the government in Beijing were very careful not to provoke the Tibetans initially. So they were taken step by step. From Tachedo, they would try out one program, and then they move further west. And by the time they got to Litang, the problem was this chieftain, the young European, and I'll show you a picture of this. Let me see. No. That's him when he was 15. Nomad. Pure nomad. And this is at a kind of studio in Tatsudo, probably run by one of the Chinese photographers there. 15-year-old, very unassuming, and this is the kind of thing that I think Dharma Karma people like. He was really religious. For him, that was it. His father had given up his, tribal chieftain position just to take a backpack and just to travel all, like the great renunciation of the Buddha, and to go all over Tibet and even to India. And he wanted to do that, but then the fighting started. And he made a vow that he would not only not surrender, he was not going to talk to the Chinese also. Because by that time, a lot of lamas and chieftains, even in eastern Tibet, were succumbing to the appeals of the Communist Party bosses. And a lot of them were taken to Tatsudo. They were taken on tours to China to see the new China and the factories, and But he wouldn't go. And then the fighting broke out, and everyone was involved. And it was very, very big. So this is him there at a young age, and then in the middle is Markham Pupapu. I knew some of his family. He was the chief of the big tribes of Markham. And why I have him here is because he was the last person to hold out. Right up till the mid-60s he was holding out. Why? Because Markham, unlike a lot of these other areas, with nomadic areas which are flat and grassland, where Chinese can bring in, armored cars and tanks, and they can have large number of people. In Markham, Markham has huge forests. These are primeval forests. Forests with these kind of trees are growing so close together that when it's raining, you can stay under a tree and you won't feel a drop. And that gave them the time, the PLA kind of attacks, when it hit them. When you're in the forest, it's much easier to defend it. So that's how he survived, but then in the end he got wiped out. And I might tell you a little, if there's time later on, about his son was involved with the CIA, and they came, a whole team came, to bring more weapons for his force. But by that time, he had died. Now, the last person I'm just bringing in, because unlike unlike European, who was a rather small, unassuming person, this guy was 7 feet tall. He was the bodyguard of the Rating region. So this photograph was taken in the 30s by Spencer Chapman. Huge guy. Very scary. Even the sword, and they believed that he had the special talismans, and how he just go through people with this huge sword. This is something like out of, Lord of the Rings or whatever, Even when he was guarding the Ratin regent, who had been accused by the Tibetan government, of misconduct, and they came to arrest him, he killed 7 of the soldiers who came to arrest him with a sword, and finally managed to get away to eastern Tibet, where he started fighting against the PLA. So these are people with wonderful stories, but I have to tell you about these 2 ladies who really, really fought also. The one on the left, she died last year. Some of you may have heard of someone called Lodi Gyari, who was in Washington. He was the Dalai Lama's representative, there, but his mother. And I knew her very well. She's very petite, and she talks with a very soft voice. sometimes in the beginning I couldn't understand what she was trying to say. But she, and I talked about the fighting, but how she managed. She was trying to tell me actually that she had received a letter from Europe, the earlier chieftain of Litang. And he has sent letters all over eastern Tibet telling the people to rise up around the time of the Tibetan New Year. And she managed to do it. She managed to collect all her troops together. Because her husband, who was the boss, and her elder sister, he had married both sisters, they had gone to one of these Chinese junkets to Chengdu, and had been held hostage. So she was at home, and then she decided she had to do something. I think the PLA chiefs where she was realized that she was plotting something. They sent some people to kill her. One person came inside her room with a hand grenade. She had a maid who grabbed that person's hand and wrestled him down, and then she just stood over him with a pistol and shot him in the head. And I think for someone who's 5'3", maybe, low, very soft voice, she was amazing. And what she did immediately after that, she gathered all the tribal sort of people there. She put on a man's chuba, hiked it up. She had a pistol, a knife, and she had a rifle. And then she gathered all those people and said, that's where the Chinese had the PLA had their main headquarters, Drumutsong, the female dragon fort. She said, I want all of you to charge when I say so. If you don't, any man backs away from this, I'm going to kill him myself. And they said, Lasso? And then he charged. No, I'm not kidding. When I met her, there were still some of those young bucks and they were much older, of course, in Dharamsala. So she was very interesting. She just started last year, really, and practicing the Dharma till the end, And next to her is another friend of mine, Ani Pajin Lemdatsang of Konjo, the tribal chieftain's daughter. He had passed away during the fighting. And they had no one to lead them, and they needed someone with that kind of tribal chieftain blood. So they asked her to do it. And she fought till the end, till there was nothing left. Like few thousand of her men had died. She was then going the mountains, carrying her grandmother, Finally they captured her, and then she was put in prison for, again, 20 years in Lhasa. She's a tough old lady, wonderful. Tibetans sometimes we have wonderful women, and ruthless also. And that's what, we don't have to sort of talk about, compassion or anything yet. When they had to kill people, they did it. And she was famous for even knocking down collaborators. A lot of Tibetans, sometimes it's difficult to kill people from your own village when they're collaborating, but she had no hesitation. But later she kept denying it. She said, no, I never said anything like this, But I remember all her servants, all the people around her, young men said, no, you gave the order to kill those people. And she said, no, I never did. But that's another story as well. But while all this was going on in eastern Tibet, now the fighting spread everywhere. Batang, Gyatang, Chating, huge places, huge monasteries. Large, eastern Tibet has a larger population than central Tibet, because land is much more productive in eastern Tibet, Population large, but a lot of people dying. And when all this was happening, the world in 1956, its attention of the Western press was focused on Hungary. That was the Hungarian uprising, if you remember. When Russian tanks, Stalin sent tanks, to Hungary. And that's where Lifetime, or even Indian press, was ignoring everything that was happening, in its backyard across the Himalayas. And comparisons are odious, but I think the fighting in Tibet was much bigger. What happened in Hungary was fairly short, because when you bring in the big tanks, it stops, But in Tibet, it just carried on and on. But there was one person who kept writing about it. And his name was Gigen Tharchin, Dorji Tharchin. And he ran the only Tibetan newspaper in Kalimpong called the Tibet Mirror. And he was an ethnic Tibetan from this place called Kinnaur, now in India. He was an orphan, and the Christian missionaries, Moravians, they picked him up. They gave him the education, looked after him. But later, of course, he was a very good Christian. He was committed to his faith. But he realized that he was a Tibetan also, culturally, right? So then he went to Tibet, and he was really proud, and he felt he had to do something for Tibetans. He started this newspaper.